Sometimes we sit back and wonder why he won't text first, even though it feels like he's thinking about you all the time. It can be frustrating, right? You're left wondering what's going on. What's the holdup? But I want you to think about this for a second. What if the reason he's not texting first isn't because he's not interested, but because he's actually trying to protect something deeper? It's easy to think that the lack of a text means something negative, like he's lost interest or doesn't care. But the truth is, there is often a fear of vulnerability hiding beneath that silence. See, for many of us, when we open ourselves up, when we put ourselves out there emotionally, it's like we're walking on a tightrope. There's always that fear of falling, of getting hurt, of being rejected. This fear is real, is palpable, and for some, even the smallest gesture of reaching out, like sending that text first, feels like it exposes them. They're putting themselves in a position where they might get hurt, and that can be a tough pill to swallow. It's not just about the text, it's about the emotional risk it carries. And let's be real, a lot of people aren't ready to take that risk, no matter how much they care. Now, you might be wondering, well, why not just take the leap and text? And I get it. We all want that connection. We all want to know where we stand. But here's the thing. When we experience hurt, rejection, or heartbreak in our past, those feelings don't just vanish. They leave behind these emotional scars. And whether we know it or not, those scars influence how we interact with people today. The truth is, some folks don't just casually toss aside their vulnerability. They guard it like treasure because they've been burned before. And sometimes the fear of going through that pain again is enough to keep them from sending that first text, even if they're thinking about you nonstop. Let me take it a little deeper. Imagine this. You've been hurt before, and now you're faced with the opportunity to connect with someone new. Your heart wants to reach out, but your mind is flashing images of what happened last time. When things fell apart, when you gave too much and got nothing in return. So, in an attempt to avoid that pain, you hold back. You don't text first. You don't want to risk putting yourself out there again. You hold on to that little bit of control because that control feels like safety. You don't want to feel exposed, vulnerable, or weak. But here's the flip side. That fear of vulnerability doesn't just protect us, it also isolates us. By holding back, by not texting first, we start to build walls around our hearts, convincing ourselves that we're protecting ourselves from future hurt. The problem is, while we're protecting ourselves, we're also robbing ourselves of the chance to grow, to heal, and to experience the kind of deep, meaningful connection that only comes when we let our guard down. And I'm not saying throw caution to the wind or ignore the lessons of the past, no. But I am saying that growth happens when we challenge that fear and choose to be vulnerable, even just a little. Here's the thing, emotional growth doesn't happen in a vacuum. We all have scars, we all have baggage, but it's what we do with that pain that defines us. Choosing to open ourselves up to the possibility of love, friendship, or connection, despite the risk, is how we transform. The truth is, the longer we let that fear control our actions, the longer we stay stuck in the past. But when we choose to embrace vulnerability, when we choose to take that emotional leap, we allow ourselves to grow in ways we never thought possible. We break down those walls. We let others in. And most importantly, we let ourselves heal. So the next time you find yourself wondering why he won't text first, remember this. It's not about you. It's about him protecting a piece of himself that's been hurt before. But don't let that stop you from understanding that your own emotional growth starts when you acknowledge that vulnerability is not a weakness, it's a strength. And when we learn to embrace that, we open ourselves up to a world of possibilities, because the greatest act of courage we can take is to love despite the fear. Sometimes we think silence is the enemy. When someone doesn't text first, we interpret it as a lack of interest, a sign of rejection, or worse, that something's wrong. But what if silence wasn't a sign of distance, but an opportunity for reflection? What if that quiet space in between the texts, the moments when things seem to slow down, is exactly where the real emotional growth happens? We talk so much about connection, about action, about being upfront, but sometimes what we really need is a moment to pause, a space to breathe, and a time to reflect. See, when he doesn't text first, it's easy to jump to conclusions and assume the worst. But if we stop and think for a moment, silence doesn't always mean absence. It could mean that he's doing something incredibly important. He's reflecting. Reflection isn't just about looking back on what happened, it's about understanding where we are, what we want, and what we're ready for. And for some people, especially when emotions are involved, that time of silence is necessary to find that clarity. We're so quick to fill the void with assumptions and insecurities, but what if instead of assuming, we allowed the silence to speak for itself? Think about it like this: when you don't immediately text back after a meaningful conversation, it doesn't always mean you're disinterested. Sometimes it means you're giving yourself the space to process, to digest, and to figure out what's next. The silence creates room for thought. It gives both people time to gather their emotions, to decide what they really feel, and to figure out what they want from this connection. This time doesn't weaken the relationship, it strengthens it. It brings depth. Now, in our fast-paced world where everything is instant, waiting feels like a challenge. We want immediate answers. We want instant connection. But growth doesn't work on a timetable. Real personal growth happens when we stop rushing and allow things to unfold naturally. It's about understanding that sometimes space is just as valuable as interaction. When we give ourselves that room, we let our feelings settle and we avoid reacting impulsively. We can ask ourselves the deeper questions. What do I want from this? What is my heart telling me? Without this space, we're just reacting, living from one emotional high to the next without ever truly understanding what we need. The silence, then, becomes a space for self-discovery, not just for the person who's holding back, but for both parties. Maybe he's taking this time to figure out how much you mean to him, or maybe he's looking at the relationship and deciding what he's truly ready for. And in that same silence, we also have the opportunity to reflect on our own desires, needs, and boundaries. Are we moving too fast? Are we relying too much on the other person for emotional validation? Space gives us the chance to step back and see the bigger picture, which allows for deeper connection when the time is right. So when you find yourself frustrated by the silence, try to view it differently. Instead of interpreting it as rejection, try seeing it as an invitation for introspection. That silence doesn't mean something's wrong. It means something's growing. When we learn to embrace the quiet, to allow ourselves that moment of reflection, we create the space for true understanding to emerge. And when the time comes to speak, we'll do it with more clarity, more authenticity, and more depth. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is sit in the silence and trust that growth is happening even when we can't see it right away. There's something we all struggle with, something that plays out in so many of our relationships, even when we don't realize it. It's this delicate balance between wanting to connect and wanting to protect ourselves. I'm talking about the battle between eagerness and independence. The push and pull that happens when we feel that inner conflict between opening up to someone and holding on to our own space. We all want to be seen, to be valued, but at the same time, there's a part of us that doesn't want to give too much. And sometimes that inner tension leads to hesitation, the very thing that might be stopping him from texting first, even if he's thinking about you constantly. You see, eagerness can be misinterpreted. It's like this fine line we walk when we care about someone. We want them to know how much they mean to us. We want to show that we're interested, but there's always that nagging fear that showing too much might be seen as weak. It might come off as desperate. Maybe we've been there before, putting ourselves out there too much and feeling like we were left hanging, feeling like we gave more than we got. So we hold back, we hesitate. It's not that we don't care, it's that we're trying to protect ourselves from getting hurt. And here's the thing, when we hesitate, we don't just protect ourselves, we create distance sometimes without even realizing it. Now, independence, being able to stand on your own, to not need anyone to complete you, that's something we all strive for. We want to feel strong, we want to feel whole, like we don't rely on anyone else for our happiness or our sense of self-worth. But here's where it gets tricky. Too much independence can make it difficult to truly connect. When we become so focused on protecting our independence, we can end up isolating ourselves. The fear of seeming too eager, of losing that sense of self, can prevent us from opening up and allowing someone in. The real question becomes, how do we navigate this tension? The truth is, balance is the key. You can be independent and still be vulnerable. You can protect your heart while still showing that you care. But it takes work. It takes knowing who you are, understanding your worth, and having the strength to show up as your true self without pretending to be someone you're not. And that's where growth comes in. Personal growth doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means you learn how to handle those feelings with grace. You learn to be comfortable with the idea that showing interest doesn't make you weak, and that keeping some space for yourself doesn't mean you're pushing others away. So when you find yourself holding back, wondering why he hasn't texted first, consider this. Maybe he's trying to balance that same fear of losing his sense of self. Maybe he doesn't want to come on too strong. And just like you, he's navigating that fine line between staying true to who he is and opening himself up to something new. It's a delicate dance and it's not always easy. But if we can accept that vulnerability and independence aren't opposites, but two sides of the same coin, we can start to break down the walls that keep us from connecting on a deeper level. At the end of the day, we all want the same thing, to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel like we matter. And if we're brave enough to allow ourselves to be both independent and open, to embrace the push and pull of connection, we create the possibility of something real, something lasting. So next time you wonder why he's holding back, remember that it's not about being too much or too little. It's about learning to be just enough, both for yourself and for someone else. Sometimes we get caught up in the idea that relationships are all about constant communication, that the more we reach out, the more we show we care. And yeah, there's some truth to that, but we also need to recognize that timing, it's everything. It's not just about when we reach out, but also when we choose to hold back. And here's the thing, timing can be a powerful tool in relationships, a tool that people often don't even realize they're wielding. You know, when he doesn't text first, it might not be because he's not thinking about you. It could be because in his mind, the timing just isn't right yet. There's a reason we sometimes pull back or hesitate before sending that message. We're trying to feel out the situation. We're trying to understand where we stand, where things are headed, and what the next step looks like. Sometimes we hold back not because we don't care, but because we're being intentional about the moment. It's like we're looking for the perfect timing, we're waiting for everything to line up before we make our move. Now, I know we've all been there. We've sent that text too soon, too eager, too early, and ended up regretting it. Or maybe we didn't wait for the right moment and jumped in without fully understanding what we wanted, only to find ourselves lost in confusion or miscommunication. That's where timing comes in. It's the space we give ourselves to make sure we're doing things for the right reasons, not just because we feel the urge to act. Timing allows us to avoid rushing in with emotion and instead approach the situation with clarity and purpose. Think about it. When you're truly trying to build something meaningful with someone, rushing it can sometimes spoil the connection. We get excited, we get impatient, and we forget that strong relationships are built on more than just constant communication. They're built on understanding and respect for one another's timing. If you're always trying to make something happen too quickly, it doesn't give the other person the chance to process, to decide what they want, or even to appreciate the relationship for what it is. And when we rush, we miss the opportunity to really see if we're in sync. That's why silence isn't a bad thing. It's a space for both people to reflect, to evaluate, and to give each other room to breathe. It's in those quiet moments that we find our true intentions. Maybe he's waiting to see if you'll make the first move because he's giving you the space to decide what you want. Maybe he's trying to gauge if this is something you're both ready for at the right time. We don't need to force things to happen faster than they should. And in the end, that's really the key to personal growth here. Understanding that things don't always need to move at the pace we think they should. We all want connection. We all want clarity. But sometimes that clarity comes from waiting, from respecting the natural rhythm of how things evolve. When we embrace the timing of life, when we stop trying to rush things or force them to happen, we give ourselves the opportunity to build something that lasts. Because true connection is never about trying to make something happen at the wrong time. It's about recognizing when the right moment presents itself and being ready to take that step when it's meant to happen. The best things in life aren't rushed. They unfold when the timing is right. I think we've all been there, sitting there staring at our phones, wondering why we haven't gotten that text yet. Maybe it's been hours, maybe it's been days. And in that moment, our minds can start running wild with all kinds of ideas, each one worse than the last. Did I do something wrong? Maybe he's just not interested. Maybe I misread everything. The problem is we're reading too much into the silence. We're putting our own expectations onto a situation that may not even be about us. And the longer we do that, the more we start spinning out of control, convincing ourselves of things that aren't true. Here's the truth. Silence doesn't always mean disinterest. It doesn't mean something's wrong. More often than not, it means we're reading too much into the moment, creating a narrative based on our own insecurities and fears. We all come into relationships with our own set of expectations, some spoken, some unspoken. And when those expectations aren't met in the exact way we want them to be, it's easy to feel like something's off, like maybe we're being ignored or undervalued. But if we're honest with ourselves, we might realize that these expectations aren't necessarily based on reality. They're based on how we want things to unfold, on how we hope they will unfold. The truth is, when we read too much into the silence, we lose sight of the bigger picture. We forget that everyone has their own pace, their own way of dealing with emotions, and their own timing for when they're ready to communicate. Maybe he's processing something. Maybe he's sorting through his own feelings. Maybe he's giving himself the space to figure out what he really wants. This doesn't necessarily have anything to do with you personally. It's about him navigating his own emotional landscape. I think sometimes we get caught up in the idea that if someone isn't texting us first, it must mean they don't care. But let me ask you this. How many times have you had moments where you needed some space to think, to reflect, or to simply breathe before reacting? It's human nature. We all need time. We all need space. And it's crucial to remember that the silence we're experiencing might not be a reflection of someone's feelings about us, but rather a chance for them to reflect on their own emotions. Now, this doesn't mean you shouldn't communicate your own feelings or expectations. But what it does mean is that when someone doesn't text first, we have to step back and ask ourselves, are we assuming things that aren't true? Are they true? Are we reading too much into the situation? Instead of getting caught up in the anxiety of waiting for that text, we can choose to trust that people communicate in different ways and at different speeds. Sometimes silence is necessary for growth, for both people. This is where the growth part comes in for us. It's about letting go of the need to control every interaction, to force things into our timeline, and instead choosing to trust the process. When we stop assuming the worst, we give ourselves the freedom to stay grounded, to understand that what's happening now isn't the final answer. It's just a moment. And in the space between texts, we have the opportunity to reflect on ourselves, our own desires, and what we really want from this connection. So the next time you find yourself anxiously waiting for a text, ask yourself, am I reading too much into the silence? Because in that space, there's room to grow, to breathe, and to trust that things will unfold when the time is right. And sometimes that's exactly what we need to find clarity and peace. The ability to let go of the need to fill every silence with our own assumptions. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. Sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves is stop trying so hard to control everything, especially when it comes to relationships. We spend so much energy trying to decode someone's silence, trying to figure out why they haven't texted first, that we forget to ask ourselves, am I truly living in the present? Or am I just trapped in my own anxiety about what might happen next? That's a tough question, but it's one that can change everything if we're brave enough to face it. The truth is, we're often so caught up in the what ifs. What if they're not interested? What if I've said something wrong? What if they never text first? That we lose sight of what's right in front of us. We get so fixated on the future, on what the next message will say or when it will come, that we forget to just be in the moment. But here's the thing, when we live in that space of constant worry and anticipation, we rob ourselves of the chance to experience real connection. We're living in a cycle of anxiety, always predicting the worst, and never allowing ourselves to fully be present with the person or the relationship we're actually in. Now, let me be clear. It's not that we shouldn't care. Of course we care. We want to know that the person we're thinking about is thinking about us too. But there's a difference between caring and overthinking. Caring comes from a place of trust. Overthinking comes from a place of fear and insecurity. When we let our minds race with every possible scenario, we start to lose touch with the reality of the situation. We start to misinterpret what's happening. We get lost in the noise. And that's where growth comes in. Personal growth is about learning to step out of that cycle of fear and into a place where we trust ourselves, trust the moment, and trust that things will unfold as they're meant to. This is where the real power lies. The power to let go of the need for constant validation, for constant reassurance. The power to say, you know what? I trust that if this relationship is meant to grow, it will. I trust that if he's meant to reach out, he will. And in the meantime, I'm going to focus on what I can control, my own growth, my own peace, my own journey. That shift from fear to trust, from anxiety to peace, is a game changer. It's not about being passive or detached. It's about being confident in who you are, in your worth, and knowing that the right people will appreciate you for exactly who you are without you having to chase them or decode their every move. When we stop trying to force things and instead start living in the present, we free ourselves from the mental and emotional prison we've built around these expectations. We start to enjoy the moments we have with people for what they are, not for what we want them to be. And in doing that, we allow space for the relationship to breathe, to grow naturally. We're no longer tied to the fear of the unknown because we've learned how to be content with what is right in front of us. So the next time you're sitting there waiting for that text, ask yourself, Am I letting the anxiety control me, or am I choosing to trust in the process? Because when we trust, when we stop trying to control every moment, that's when we allow the magic of true connection to unfold. And the best part, we don't need to force it. It will happen when the time is right.